Hi everybody. I know that we've been working on finding images, and you've done a lot of work looking at magazines and imagery that way that we can cut out and work with. We're going to be looking at other elements with this project where we need to do the same thing, but in a different way, a different approach, writing things, sketching things in a sketchbook and scanning those in, thinking about how do we actually find images in a variety of ways, kind of one of the purposes. And then since I'm not going to be here much this week, Monday was a day off, remember, I want to talk a little about composition. So how do we start to think about gathering all of the things that we have, and how do we organize them, how do we arrange them to form a piece of design? And the idea is here with intent. So our intention is to actually get people to come and watch this movie. And we're going to grab their attention with imagery or text, but how do we give them the information they need after we've grabbed them and drawn them into what you've created? So we're going to look a little bit about composition here today. And one of the things to think about as you're thinking about composition is how are we going to use the space as a whole? And there's a variety of ways of doing this. You could leave a border around it. When we actually measure out the 11 by 17 piece of paper, you're going to have a border around it, but we're going to trim that away. So do you want something like a bleed, where all of your imagery goes off all four edges? It doesn't have to be the same element. You could take a image off the bottom and then a different image off one of the sides, etc., or the text off one of the edges. But a bleed is a helpful tool for designers to use, and in this kind of visual solution might be a good approach compared to a margin where we might have in a textbook, for example, where you have a border that's consistent. You might not want to have everything bleed off the edges, so you can actually use a partial bleed too, but think about how you can use the space that you have for a bleed in your layout. So what makes a good composition? Now there's a handful of different things that can do this. I'm just going to highlight a few, and I want you to be thinking about them as you are finding imagery, as you are thinking about where they go on the page. So one of the things to look at is the focal point. How can you draw someone's attention in? How can you draw their eyes? How can you catch it and bring them in and help them understand what it is? How can you grab their attention? So a focal point is what we see first, generally, and it could be text, again, it could be an image. How can we guide their attention in? How can we grab their attention? An easy way of thinking about that is using something called the rule of thirds, where things don't need to be centered on the page. They can be, but they don't need to be for rule of thirds. So if we divide it into 3 rows and 3 columns, shifting things over or up, kind of like this bird is on the right, is over on the right third, or the left third, you could do it. So how do we pay attention to that? But how do you create a focal point that draws the viewer in? It may be with size, it might be with value changes, it might be with more contrast, different color, those kinds of things. So what are you going to do to get the viewer's attention? Some of the things to think about with this are how are we going to then guide the viewer through? If everything is aligned, having something off alignment or out of alignment will grab attention. Everything else will be consistent and related. Maybe something one direction versus a bunch of other directions. Maybe something, an element that has one shape versus other shapes, or is orientated just slightly different, right? Something that is grouping everything related in proximity, and then something that is all alone by itself. But using a rhythm or a scale, those are other tools that you can use to help guide the viewer through and help them notice what it is that you're trying to tell them. What you're trying to communicate with them. So there's a lot of different options, even visual weight. Where do we put the heaviest image? Where do we put the largest image? Where do we put the thing that is we want to grab first? So just some topics that we'll kind of come back to. Another thing that you want to think about, so we talked about focal point. What do you want them to see first, second, third, fourth, etc.? How do you use leading lines? How do you guide the viewer through what it is that you want them to understand? How do you direct them through? And if you look at this example on the right, this is couple decades old, but it's a poster that talks a little bit about safety for kids around motorcycles. But what do you see first? You might see this motorcycle wheel tire first, and then these lines in it draw you to this child, or maybe you see the child first. Kind of depends on your interpretation, how you look at it. But how do you guide the viewer through? It's an important thing to think about. Also think about the background. A more simple background will help something in the foreground stand out. So making everything just kind of blend together, that's a natural thing to do, but how do we make something stand away from what's behind it, what's next to it, etc. So you might think about something in the back being a little bit blurry, and then something in the front being, visually in the front, having a little more attention, a little more focus. Kind of like this particular poster from San Francisco where we see the bridge first, because the background is a different color and a little bit blurry, a little bit more abstracted, just a different way of looking at it. But the subtle background will help simplify things and help draw attention to what you want the viewer to see first. So as you think about that, how do we create depth? How do we have something that's in the foreground? How do we have something that's in the background? And how do we work together, right, as you lay things out? So even though we're working in 2 dimensions, how do you pay attention to and focus on things that people see closer to them, further away? That can be scale, that can be overlapping. There's a lot of different ways that you can look into that, and we'll get into that more when we look at this term. But maybe you want to use layering. Physically, we are layering things with what you've cut out, right? You put one piece of paper on top of another. That's a layer. But what we also want to pay attention to is how much white space that you use. So how much breathing room something has, an element has around it. And if whatever that focal point is, how do we see that first? A good benefit is thinking about white space as we look, right? How do we see that? It's got some space around it. Oops. So if you look at something like these are 3 different posters for something going on. The one on the left, maybe you consider focal point being text. It could be the title of the film that we're promoting, right? So this one on the left uses that, and then it guides the viewer through with this line, this orangish line. It almost looks like an explosion, but it's all connecting everything, right? Second one in the middle uses the image as the drawn element. That's the focal point, and then there are lines that are leading the viewer down to the title, who it's by, the dates, those kinds of things. But look at the white space around that. It's not cramped. It's simple. That's an option. On the right kind of combines both of those. You have this text that's made out of the image. Maybe you play with that a little bit. But there's more texture going on, but you do have some depth, especially with the clouds in the background versus this umbrella in the foreground. But there's layering, there's depth that way. So another way of some ways of thinking about it. What do you want to see first? Text, image, or maybe a combination of those two. Okay, so as we combine them, something to think about is putting everything together. Maybe you run something across what's behind it. Maybe you blend it together so it looks like in the upper left, the one where the word tweet is actually part of the bird. Maybe you want to give it white space. Maybe you want to give it a frame around it. There's a lot of different ways. And I'm not showing you these because they may be right or wrong. I'm just showing you some ways of thinking about it. But how do you use the space that you're working with? A couple other things to think about. Alignment is a huge component of graphic design. So elements are linked a little bit better as they are sharing a common line. And that line can be some things going to the left, some things going to the right. It can be space between an image or an object. It can be just centered. Centered is safe. It is safe. How do we move beyond that a little bit and still make it interesting as we look at alignment? That shared edge, left aligned, center aligned, right aligned are the 3 basic ones, the types of alignment that we can think about. But sharing an edge with one component or another, or one piece of text or another, is really necessary as we consider this. So here's a couple images to just wrap it up. This book cover, you might see the word cockroach first because of the color contrast. So think about how you keep things simple, how you give it differences between or space between foreground and background. Talk a little bit about depth that way. You might have this line of this foot that's drawn in where it's kind of angling down to the letters. Maybe you see that combined and they're aligned, right? And then there's some space on the top and the bottom. Just another way of thinking about that. You can use this image to really draw you in. Now this one's a little bit harder to read, I think, because there's not a whole lot of contrast between the magnetic letters versus the image on the background, but this image with its multiple, or its head turned multiple ways, can really draw your attention. Perhaps that's some kind of image-focused intention versus text-focused intention. You can combine that in a bunch of different ways as well. So this one kind of uses things that maybe you would be considering is there are textures, there's things that are scanned, there's things that are drawn, there's things that are photographed. So how can you combine those elements into a composition that fits together? Unity we'll get into down the road, but how do you make things feel like they all fit together?